The bread Jesus broke had no yeast, no waiting, and only minutes to live. It was not a soft loaf from a bakery shelf. It was not risen, sweet, padded with air, or made for comfort. It was flour, water, salt, and heat, pressed thin enough to cook before the meal could pass it by. That matters because at the Passover table, Jesus did not reach for ordinary bread. He took the bread of haste. He took the bread of affliction. He took bread tied to the night Israel fled Egypt, and then he broke it before the cross. Hold the method for a moment. The 18-minute loaf is coming. But before your hands mix the flour, the old kitchen has to speak. To understand why this bread had to be fast, we go back to the night Israel left Egypt. Picture a small home in first-century Jerusalem as Passover draws near. The room is crowded before the meal even arrives. Clay lamps burn low. A table is being prepared. Bitter herbs are rinsed and set aside. Cups are placed where hands can reach them. Somewhere close, lamb is roasting, and the smell of smoke clings to the walls. In the corner, someone works with flour. There is no bowl set aside for a long rise. There is no morning dough swelling under cloth. There is no sour smell of fermentation moving slowly through the house. A woman pours water into flour and draws it together with her fingers. She works quickly because this bread is not built around waiting. This bread remembers leaving. The dough is plain. It is firm, but still alive under the hand. She presses it flat against wood or stone, thinner than a common loaf, because thickness would steal time. The fire is ready. A hot stone waits. The clay oven holds its heat. Once the dough is mixed, it must move toward the flame. That is the feeling modern bread usually hides from us. We are used to convenience wrapped in softness. Bread comes sliced, bagged, sweetened, and quiet. It waits for us on a shelf. Passover bread did not wait. It carried urgency in its very shape. It was survival food before it became ritual food. It was the kind of bread a household could make when there was no time to coax yeast, no time to let dough breathe, no time to make life feel settled. And when Jesus gathered with his disciples for that final Passover meal, this kind of bread was there on the table. Not as decoration, not as a prop, as food handled by real hands in a room full of memory, fear, obedience, and love. That is why Scripture does not treat unleavened bread as decoration. It names it as memory. The edible proof object is simple enough to miss: unleavened Passover bread. In Exodus chapter 12, the command comes with urgency. Israel is told to eat the Passover meal with loins girded, sandals on the feet, and staff in the hand. The meal belongs to a people ready to move. The lamb is eaten in haste, and the bread is unleavened because the dough has no time to rise. A few verses later, the memory becomes physical. They carry their dough before it is leavened. Their kneading bowls are wrapped up in their cloaks. Exodus does not give us an abstract lesson first. It gives us a kitchen detail. Dough in a bowl, no yeast, no delay. Deuteronomy chapter 16 gives that bread a name that should make us slow down. It calls it the bread of affliction. That phrase is heavy. It means the bread carried pain, pressure, poverty, and deliverance in the same bite. It reminded Israel that they left Egypt in haste and that the Lord brought them out with a mighty hand. So when the Gospels bring us into the upper room, The bread is already speaking. Matthew chapter 26 says Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples. Mark chapter 14 gives the same action. Luke chapter 22 says he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 remembers the same table, the same thanksgiving, the same breaking, and the words, "This is my body." At a Passover meal, that bread would have been unleavened. That does not mean every detail of the table looked like a modern Passover plate. Traditions grew and changed over time. But the biblical command for the feast is clear. The bread of Passover was bread without leaven. Bread made without the slow swelling that turns dough into something airy and soft. That small absence, no yeast, changes the whole meaning of the meal. Yeast does something beautiful in dough. It feeds, it produces gas, and it fills the dough with little pockets of air. Fermentation can soften the grain, deepen the flavor, and give bread that rounded smell we know so well. Given time, dough becomes lighter under the hand. Unleavened bread refuses that process. It stays direct. Flour meets water, salt sharpens it, heat fixes it. The result is closer to the ground than a raised loaf. It bends when warm, especially if it is not rolled too thin, but it does not puff into a soft cushion. It browns in spots. It may blister. It tears instead of slicing neatly. Simple does not mean empty. When you hold unleavened bread, you feel what was removed. No rise, no waiting, no comfort of delay. It is food made for obedience under pressure. That is why this bread belongs so naturally to Exodus. It tastes like people who could not stay where they were. Put that beside your pantry. Modern bread is often designed for softness, repeatability, long shelf life, and a texture that asks almost nothing of the teeth. Many loaves are made to feel tender for days. That is useful in a modern grocery system, but it also means the bread can become disconnected from the grain, the labor, and the meal that gave it meaning. The shortcut did not merely change the shelf life, it changed the food. A Passover flatbread made from whole grain flour can feel more substantial because the bran and germ remain in the flour. Modern nutrition research has found that fiber in whole grains may slow how quickly a meal is digested compared with refined white flour. That does not make this bread a cure, and it does not make one flour holy and another flour worthless. It simply helps explain why older breads often carried the body differently. Refined flour is smoother. Whole grain flour is more stubborn. It absorbs water with more character. It darkens the dough. It makes the bread taste like wheat instead of pure softness. The ancient cook may not have spoken in modern nutrition terms, but she knew the dough by feel. She knew when a dough needed a splash more water. She knew when flour was thirsty. She knew that a thin cake would cook fast on a hot stone, while a thick one would stay raw in the center. She knew that bread for a feast still had to feed the body. And this bread had a message built into its texture. Every bite reminded the family that deliverance did not come with leisure. It came with command, movement, trust, and fire. Go back into that house before sunset. The air is tense but not chaotic. People know what must be done. The room has the steady pressure of a family preparing for a holy meal. Someone checks the lamps. Someone watches the lamb. Someone sets herbs where the meal will be eaten. A child comes too close to the work and is gently moved back. The flour is measured by hand. Maybe it is wheat. Maybe it is barley in a poorer house. In later kitchens, it might be finer flour, but the principle is the same. Grain is ground, gathered, and brought into a bowl. Salt is added, not enough to dominate, just enough to wake the bread. Water goes in slowly. The hand knows before the eye does. Too much water, and the dough smears against the board. Too little, and it cracks at the edges. The cook folds it, presses it, turns it, and presses again. She is not kneading for a high loaf. She is only bringing flour and water into one obedient piece. There is no resting bowl with a cloth over it for hours. No swelling mound on the table. No house filled with the smell of yeast waking up. This dough moves quickly because the story moves quickly. A flat round is pressed out on a wooden board or a smooth stone. The edges are rough. The surface is not perfect. A few dry patches are worked back in with damp fingers. If it is too thick, it will fight the heat. If it is too thin, it will turn brittle. The ancient cook knew the difference. Near the fire, the bread changes fast. Pale dough tightens. Steam pushes through. Brown spots appear where the surface meets heat. The smell is not sweet like a bakery loaf. It is grain, smoke, and salt. It is the scent of food made without luxury. A child smells the roasting lamb and watches the bread blister. Bitter herbs sit washed and sharp nearby. The table is being gathered in pieces: bread, lamb, herbs, cups, memory. Nothing about that bread is casual. It is ordinary work, but it is holy work, because God told Israel to remember with food. The command did not stay in the mind. It moved into mouths, hands, tables, and children's questions. But this bread was not only kitchen work. It carried a story every Israelite child was meant to remember. The story is the night Egypt could no longer hold them. Israel had lived under bondage. Brick, labor, command, and cruelty had marked the days. Then came the Passover, the lamb, the blood, the meal eaten in readiness, the command to move when God opened the door. Exodus says they baked unleavened cakes of the dough they had brought out of Egypt because it was not leavened. They had been driven out and could not delay. The bread did not rise because the people could not remain. That is why Deuteronomy calls it the bread of affliction. It is not fancy bread. It is not feast bread in the way modern people think of a feast. It is the taste of a hard place left behind and a promise not yet fully seen. Here is the turn. At the Last Supper, Jesus takes that bread, a bread already full of memory, a bread that speaks of haste, suffering, deliverance, and trust. Then he gives thanks, breaks it, and gives it to his disciples, and he says, "This is my body." Those words did not fall onto an empty table. They landed on Passover. They landed on Exodus. They landed on bread that had already taught Israel how to remember rescue through affliction. Jesus does not erase the old memory. He fills the table with the meaning of his coming sacrifice. The bread of affliction is in his hands on the night before the cross. The bread of haste is broken by the one who is about to be taken. The bread of deliverance is given by the one through whom Christians confess deliverance has come. So when you make unleavened bread, you are not recreating the Last Supper as if your kitchen were the upper room.
You are letting your hands learn why that bread mattered.
And now the old table comes forward into the modern kitchen through the simplest recipe on this channel. For one small 18-minute unleavened loaf, use 1 cup of flour. Whole wheat flour will give you a sturdier, earthier bread. If you want a softer texture while still keeping some whole grain character, use half whole wheat flour and half all-purpose flour. Add 1/4 teaspoon of salt. That is the dry bowl. Stir the flour and salt together with your fingers or a spoon. Then add about 1/3 cup of water gradually. Do not pour it all in at once. Flour changes with age, brand, and humidity. Add most of the water, mix, and then judge the dough. It should come together into a firm, workable ball. If dry flour remains at the bottom, add water by the teaspoon. If it turns sticky, dust in a little more flour. The core promise is flour, water, salt, and heat. If you want the bread a little more pliable, you may add 1 teaspoon of olive oil. That is not required for the simplest form. It changes the tenderness, but the heart of the bread remains the same. For a strict flour, water, salt, and heat version, leave the oil out. Set a cast iron skillet over medium-high heat. Let it get hot while you mix. You can also use a baking stone or a heavy sheet pan in an oven heated to about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. The skillet gives you fast browning and a feel closer to cooking on a hot surface. The oven gives you a drier, more even flatbread. Knead the dough briefly. 30 seconds is enough for a rough loaf. 1 minute is plenty. You are not building a tall bread. You are only smoothing the dough so it can be pressed thin. If the dough fights you, let it sit for 2 or 3 minutes. That short pause is for handling, not rising. There is no yeast working. There is no fermentation taking over. The water is simply moving through the flour so the dough rolls without tearing. Press the dough into 1 flat round, or divide it into 2 smaller rounds if your skillet is small. Roll it or press it thin, about 1/8 of an inch if you want a pliable bread, thinner if you want something crisper. Keep the edges as even as you can, but do not chase perfection. This is hand bread. If you like, prick the surface with a fork. That helps limit large bubbles. If a bubble rises anyway, press it gently with a spatula. The bread should still have life in it. Brown spots are welcome. On a hot skillet, cook the bread for 2 to 3 minutes on the first side. Watch the surface change from damp to dry. Look for brown spots underneath. Flip it, then cook the second side for another 2 to 3 minutes. If it browns too fast before the center cooks, lower the heat slightly. If it stays pale and stiff, raise the heat. In the oven, place the flat dough on the hot stone or pan and bake for 6 to 8 minutes. Check it early. The bread should look dry on the surface, lightly browned in places, and firm enough to lift. If rolled very thin, it can become cracker-like. If left a little thicker, it should bend while warm. The texture tells you the truth. This bread will not be fluffy. Do not wait for a pillow. Do not expect sandwich bread. When warm, it should be pliable enough to break and fold with browned spots and a clean grain smell. If it snaps hard, you rolled it thin or baked it longer. That is still useful at the table, but the softer version feels closer to bread meant to be broken by hand. Serve it warm if you can. Break it rather than cutting it neatly. Put it beside bitter herbs, olive oil, lentils, roasted lamb if that belongs at your table, or a simple meal of soup and greens. If you are setting a Passover-style learning table as a Christian household, keep the tone reverent. Let the bread teach haste, affliction, and deliverance without pretending you have mastered every ancient custom. Once you make it, the word unleavened stops sounding like a religious term and starts feeling like bread in the hand. It feels plain. It feels urgent. It asks you to chew. It does not entertain you with sweetness. It carries the meal instead of trying to become the meal. That is part of the lesson. This bread is not a medical cure. It is not a replacement for dietary advice. If you have celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, diabetes, or any strict medical diet, follow professional guidance for your own body. Whole grain flour may be useful for many people who tolerate it, but it is not a purity test, and it is not a badge of faith. The purpose here is practice joined to Scripture. Modern Christians may not keep Passover in the same covenantal way as Jewish households. We should speak carefully and learn humbly. But Christians can still notice the food Jesus handled. We can read Exodus chapter 12 and Luke chapter 22 with more attention after our own hands have mixed flour, water, salt, and heat. The bread Jesus broke was simple, but it was not empty. The 18-minute loaf reveals more than a recipe. It shows haste. It shows humility. It shows affliction remembered around a table. It shows deliverance tasted, not merely discussed. And in the hands of Jesus, it becomes part of the body language of the Last Supper. Make it once, break it warm. Let the rough edge sit in your palm for a moment before you eat. Then open Exodus chapter 12 again. Read about the meal eaten in haste. Read Luke chapter 22 again. Listen to Jesus give thanks, break the bread, and give it to his disciples. The words will not feel flat in the same way. Share it with someone at your table. A spouse, a friend, a child, a neighbor who loves Scripture. Let them feel how fast the bread comes together and how much memory it carries. And if you want more biblical foods reconstructed from Scripture, history, and the old kitchen, subscribe to Scripture Kitchen. We keep returning to the table because Scripture keeps naming real food. Warm flatbread, broken by hand, an open Bible beside it. Notice what was sitting there all along.